and came to the finding that the most attractive markets for green hydrogen are Germany, France, and Spain, due to several reasons.
Once again, we are talking about hydrogen in the Smartery podcast. Why, you might ask? Haven't we heard enough about it already in the past episodes? Well, we did, but for good reason. It's simply because in 2021, there is no way around this discussion. If we want to reach our climate goals of decarbonizing completely by 2050, hydrogen has an essential role to play, especially in steel production, the chemical industry, the heating market, or the transport sector. The big question, though, is how big of a role will hydrogen really play? Which market dynamics could you count on? What are reliable numbers to really work with beyond the hype? So stay tuned for the next round about 20 minutes and you will get some answers. Welcome to the Smartery podcast, a podcast for and with the creators of the new energy world. A world in which energy will be renewable, decentralized, and digital, bringing together electricity, heat, and mobility. Let us show you how we will get there and who will get us there. My guest today is Alexander Esser. He has exactly the profile we were looking for this episode. On the one hand, he has a background as an engineer with a focus on energy storage, having studied and worked amongst other things at the Fraunhofer Institute. And on the other hand, he looks at the development through the lens of an economist currently working at Aurora Energy Research and specifically focusing on the hype around hydrogen and trying to see the real numbers and the real potential behind the boom. Well, Alexander, welcome. It's a real pleasure to have you here.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So let's get the most important question out of the way before we go into the technicalities later. Which hydrogen stock do I need to invest in?
That's a good question. I personally think that all hydrogen stocks are probably overvalued at the moment. I would not invest at this point. You should have invested a year ago, probably.
All right. Thanks a lot for playing along and giving us a small oracle insight. But yes, I think that was a very interesting key point. The perfect bridge for my very first question is that I think it's overvalued. And it's exactly your job to see and to look at the real potential behind the boom. I mean, the boom, I think, is real. It's not a over-exaggerated hype that will pass. I think the boom is to stay. Some predictions say that the market volume of hydrogen globally will amount to 100 billion euros by 2050. I guess the question is really like, what exact development are we looking at? What range will it play and which numbers can we really work on at the moment? So what market development are you looking at and what numbers do you feel confident sharing with us?
Yeah, Sakis, that's a really good question. And I mean, we get this a lot, especially around if it's a hype or not. And our role as energy economists in the end is to demystify such a hype and look at the economics because they count in the end. Do I believe it's a hype? I believe there is a hype around this concept that hydrogen is the silver bullet to solve everything, to solve all of our problems with the energy transition. I don't think that it is the silver bullet, as on the pathway to achieving net zero, renewables deployment on a global scale will be still the mainstay. But there are plenty of roadblocks that we hit on a technical level, but also on a societal level. And two of those roadblocks can be solved by the molecule hydrogen. One is that we still have very hard to abate sectors. So, for example, around 27% of the global emissions from fossil fuels in industry come from this hard-to-abate sectors like steel or cement production. And hydrogen can help to integrate renewables. So personally, I think hydrogen will play a crucial part towards 2050. And this has also been recognized by many of the policymakers and manifested in their strategies. And now we see utilities, industries, and companies like the companies we could invest in following.
Maybe let's look at the transition from the status quo to the deployment in the future. At the moment, hydrogen, mostly on a large scale, is exclusively used in industries such as ammonia production or refineries. How will that sector be affected? And then what is your prediction then for the employment in other sectors such as heavy-duty transport, the heating sector, etc.? I know, for example, ThyssenKrupp in Germany, I think, just launched a pilot with a steel oven powered by hydrogen in Germany.
Yeah, indeed. So you just mentioned actually two of those hard-to-abate sectors I called out earlier. So one is hydrogen as a feedstock. So we have today gray hydrogen in the demand of 55 terawatt hours in Germany, going into refineries, into ammonia production. And this can be easily replaced by a low carbon hydrogen. So for example, green or blue hydrogen. But there are also other hard to abate sectors where hydrogen will play a big role. One is steel production, cement production, lime production. And here we actually see large potential for new hydrogen consumption. In transport, I think hydrogen will only play a role for transport classes that have a really high utilization and long operation hours. So for example, trucks or public buses are probably the first candidates. So they want to run over long distances without interruptions for charging. The weight on board is very important. So hydrogen represents a good alternative to electrification. Applications in aviation, in planes or in shippings also potential, but they're likely further out. So overall, I think the range for hydrogen consumption in Germany could be between 140 and 500 terawatt hours by 2050. That's a large range. That's because there are big uncertainties around other transport classes. So cars, for example, or light good vehicles, but also the building heat sector. And this is for me the biggest unknown. So how will we actually decarbonize the building heat sector? And maybe here questions for you, Takis. How do you heat your apartment?
That's a very good question. I think I'm like one of these children who think that milk comes out of the milk package. It's like I just turn on the radiator and I have no clue what's going on in the basement, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, and that's where the problem starts. I mean, of course, we know in Germany that the majority of heating systems are still based on fossil fuels, on gas or oil. But another problem is that people just don't know what they actually heat with, and they're also not really interested in changing it. So we have extremely low renovation rates, extremely low rates of heating system replacements. And even though we have cheap and carbon neutral options like heat pumps. So one way of going around this problem that we have so low renovation rates is to turn hydrogen into green methane, into synthetic methane, and use the existing infrastructure. So use the distribution grid, use your gas boiler that you very likely actually have in your apartment or somewhere in the basement, and burn this synthetic methane there based on hydrogen. So that's one idea, but it's definitely not the cheapest. I think the cheaper one would be to replace your heating system by a heat pump.
That's interesting. I know that I remember that one of our previous guests already mentioned that the potential of hydrogen in the form of synthetic fuel also for airplanes, where you can just use the existing infrastructure or the existing motors or drivetrains instead of replacing them.
Before we continue, here a quick shout out to our partner for this episode, which is the Austrian company Fronius. With its Soul Hub, which was singled out at the Smarter E Award 2020 in the Smart Renewable Energy category, Fronius offers a complete turnkey solution for decentralized hydrogen production, storage, and supply. This innovative system provides municipalities, businesses, and industrial companies with a sustainable mobility and energy solution.
So let's come back to the market dynamic. The EU Commission's hydrogen strategy presented last July, I think is looking at the construction of 40 gigawatts of electrolyzer capacity by 2030, so in around about 10 years. EU countries such as Germany, the Netherlands, France, Spain, Portugal, they have all their own national hydrogen strategies, Germany being probably the one with the most ambitious goals here. If you put all of that together, what is the potential in terms of demand and supply, as well as availability of infrastructure, such as pipelines, hydrogen storage facilities, etc., in the individual European countries?
Yeah, you mentioned this promise of 40 gigawatts in Europe by 2030. And if you actually stack up the commitments by the different member states that have already a hydrogen strategy in place, you reach 32. So I think we're on a good way. And looking at the different markets in Europe, we see a lot of commitment for this hydrogen economy. But I think it's really interesting actually to compare the different markets with each other. And that's what we've done also in one of our recent studies, and came to the finding that the most attractive markets for green hydrogen are Germany, France, and Spain, due to several reasons. One is they have the most developed hydrogen strategies that are not that vague as for other countries, but have very clear targets for 2025, 2030, but also how to push hydrogen basically into industry. Then they also have the policy that really favors green over other colors, so for example blue. So Germany is very strong on that. They basically say in the long run they only accept green hydrogen. They see blue maybe as a temporary fuel, but in the end, they only want to incentivize green hydrogen. And for those three countries, the economics on the supply side really also makes sense. Given that we have a very ambitious growth of renewables, best example is Germany with our offshore targets that have recently been pushed up, but also Spain, where we do have already a lot of electricity coming from photovoltaic, resulting in a lot of hours during the year with very low prices. And obviously this is good for an electrolyzer who can utilize those low prices and produce hydrogen. Those are for me the most prominent market, Germany, France, and Spain.
How much is the development of the hydrogen sector and also of the market potential dependent on these national strategies being molded into the EU strategy? Because I can imagine, for example, if you have to power the ThyssenKrupp steel oven in a town in Germany, that's one thing. But if you want to employ hydrogen-powered trucks all across Europe on pan-European logistics, then you really need the pan-European infrastructure.
Yeah, I mean, I think as for almost all energy-related policies, taking a European perspective is always superior. And this is also the case here. When it comes to transportation, as you mentioned, it's really important to take a European view on that, to develop a system that works for the whole region. But it's also relevant in other dimensions. So, for example, certification. When is green hydrogen actually green hydrogen? And at the moment, we actually have several different standpoints on that. The French believe that green hydrogen can also be produced by nuclear power. Germans have a completely different view. So to have a European-wide certification system is also very important. But also to boost the demand. I mean, you talked about ThyssenKrupp, and obviously we could put obligations on German steel producers to use green hydrogen, and they would probably then produce green steel at a higher cost. But how can they stay competitive compared to other steel producers across Europe? So the best option here is also to take a European, maybe even a global perspective on such policy.
Before we come to the effect of hydrogen on renewables, just a quick question. Do you feel confident to share some year numbers? For example, if we really envision a truck starting in Berlin, driving to Lisbon, being powered by hydrogen. So when will we have the necessary infrastructure?
That's hard to say, but we definitely see that in this heavy truck, heavy goods vehicle space, that this is going to be one of the first ones. And we do have a lot of refueling stations that are already been built. We see a lot of the German Stadtwerke are very open to make this happen in their cities. So I would definitely think that this can be done before 2030.
Great. So then a big other topic is obviously, since we here are at the Smarter E, so we always look how the different puzzle pieces of the new energy world fit into each other. So what are the effects of the hydrogen development on the development of renewables?
Yeah, I guess there are several positive effects on renewables. So first of all, I think the economics of renewables increase or improve. I explained the example for Spanish solar earlier. So hydrogen is producing when we have a really high share of renewables producing as well. So during those hours, the prices are lifted and therefore the economics of renewables improve as low price periods are absorbed. Overall, in Germany, we see that capture prices, so a metric to measure this economics, increase by 12%. Second reason, second argument is that we actually have additional PPA volume to feed the electrolyzers. It's only one concept, but you could think about it like that you need around 20 additional terawatt hours to provide the electrolyzers in Germany committed in the German hydrogen strategy with green power. And a third concept, which is still with a lot of question marks, but it could actually work, is that hydrogen electrolyzers can capture the otherwise curtailed power. So as we have the problem with a lot of offshore wind, but also onshore wind farms, that their power is curtailed due to grid congestions, this problem can be solved by having a co-located electrolyzer who absorbs that power in those very hours if this electrolyzer is located very strategically at this very location.
That does sound all very peachy, but are there some challenges or problems as well?
Yeah, I mean, if you zoom out a bit, now we talked a lot about green hydrogen produced in Europe or in Germany even. I mean, it's going to be more of a European or more of almost a global market. So there is competition from other countries that could produce hydrogen cheaper. We see actually that hydrogen imports from Morocco at a hub in Germany, so already including the transport cost, can be 17% cheaper than the domestic green production. So there is a lot of competition from abroad and from other technologies. So we didn't talk about blue hydrogen at all, but hydrogen produced by steam reforming and then capturing the CO2 and storing it in a reservoir is still the cheaper option as of today.
So since you mentioned at the moment the cost effectiveness of blue hydrogen, I think you also mentioned that, for example, France considers electrolyzers powered by nuclear energy, as green hydrogen, which is quite funny from a German perspective. But so are there also different national approaches when it comes to blue hydrogen?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we here see even that our closest neighbors have a completely different approach to it. So, for example, the Netherlands are very technology agnostic here and have even a subsidy scheme in place, the SDE++, that lets green hydrogen compete with blue hydrogen for subsidies. And we very likely will actually see the first reservoir in continental Europe for CCS opening up before the port of Rotterdam. So just around the corner, we basically see blue hydrogen being produced and carbon being saved offshore. So it is a very different approach by the Dutch compared to the Germans.
So we see that even our closest neighbors, the closest neighbors to Germany, have a very different strategy. Well, Germany usually has quite a decisive role when it comes to EU policies. So what's the German path at the moment? We have a super election year coming up. Are the different parties in Germany all on the same path, or will the election also decide the national strategy of Germany?
Yeah, it's a super interesting year, actually. On one hand, we have now this hydrogen strategy that needs to be implemented this year. So we know we will see this carbon CFDs in industry. We know we will have tenders for electrolyzers. We know we have to define what is green hydrogen on a national level. So a lot of open questions that are debated in Germany at the moment. On the other hand, we likely will have a green-black government in Germany, even with the Greens having aspirations to take a bigger role in energy policy, maybe even taking over the BMW I don't know. But so it's going to be really interesting to see what this new government later this year will then do out of this open questions and decide about hydrogen certification, about the incentivization for hydrogen production and demand.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. So this is something we cannot discuss further until elections have actually happened in Germany. So the outcome is yet to be decided. So thanks for the numbers so far. What's the next trend, or what's the next step for you as an institute? What will you look at?
I mean, we're currently starting to look closer into the role of hydrogen in the Nordic markets. So, for example, Sweden and Norway, super interesting markets as we have plenty of wind generation and generation from hydropower, so almost emission-free on the power side, and extremely low prices. So the perfect conditions for hydrogen production, green hydrogen production. On the other hand, we have a country as Norway, who is very strong on producing blue hydrogen with one of the big CCS reservoirs, Northern Light. So looking at this competition there and the economics will be our next big task.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It's been very enlightening talking to you. And so far, I was not aware that apart from talking about a green, blue or gray hydrogen, that there can be so many different versions of green hydrogen itself, for example. And that is quite important to see what national lens you're looking at through to know whether actually you're talking about green hydrogen, meaning electrolyzers being powered by renewables and what kind of renewables, or being powered by a nuclear plant in France. That's quite a staggering difference, I suppose. So quite interesting. That means hydrogen, as you mentioned, will be here and is here to stay. However, there are very different versions of green hydrogen, and it's important that we challenge our assumptions in the discussions. Well, thank you very much for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was lovely talking to you.
Stay tuned for more episodes of the Smarter E podcast.
Exciting presentations on current innovations, trends and solutions in the field of hydrogen can also be found at the Green Hydrogen Conference as part of the Smarter E Europe in Munich. You can find all info online at ees-europe.com/green-hydrogen-conference.